that you may not abandon this city.
The time was 1948, when the first great battle of the Cold War began playing out here in Berlin, as symbolized by this grand old gate, the Brandenburg Gate, long the milepost for East-West division and conflict. The struggle occurred shortly after World War II and went on for a year, with the Soviet Union trying to drive out the Western Allies from Berlin. A time when old friends became enemies, and old enemies became friends. A frightening time, soon to be climaxed by one of the most remarkable rescue missions of the 20th century.
The following corporations provided major funding for this program.
We're Daimler-Benz. We build and finance automobiles. We also build and finance mass transit systems and trains, school buses and trucks, and airplanes. Working in America, Daimler-Benz.
Mobil is proud to partner in this program as part of its support to provide the energy that helps public television run. Additional funding was provided by the German Information Center, New York, the Checkpoint Charlie Foundation, and Rias Berlin Commission.
Berlin's once proud architecture is only a memory. Thousands of tons of bombs have pockmarked the famous Brandenburg Gate. All Nazi government buildings have been destroyed, burying the infamous Hitler and Goebbels in their rubble. Berlin's history as one of the world's great capitals is ended.
It was a city of the dead. There were corpses under every building, and the place stank of rotting flesh. Lord Tedder, who had commanded the British Air Force during the war, wrote, "The safest, simplest thing would be now to flatten it completely and put grass over it. It could never be a city."
There was this sense of destruction that pervaded it. Social destruction, physical destruction.
It was unbelievably poor. People had no clothing. They had no food. They had no transportation. The only jobs they had is to clear the rubble.
Berlin's women have been set to work to clear up the rubble from the streets. It will be years before the scars of war are removed, if ever. The Germans pay the price of war.
And the price for Nazi atrocities inflicted on innocent people. In the case of Berlin, war's end in 1945 brought a harsh and cruel Soviet occupation. The city ravaged and pillaged. When the Americans and the British came marching in 2 months after the Soviets, Berliners were apprehensive of the future.
Here, where German Kaisers first plotted world domination, Britons, Russians, and Americans meet after crushing those ambitions.
The wartime partners, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, vowed a desolate Germany must not again become an aggressive Germany. So they came together at Potsdam on the outskirts of Berlin in the summer of 1945 to discuss building a lasting peace. They agreed to divide Germany into 4 zones of occupation, with the French controlling the 4th zone. Likewise, 4 sectors for Berlin, which would remain the capital.
That meant that the 3 Western Allies, the United States, Britain, and France, were 120 miles inside the Soviet zone of occupation, all their communications with their zones of occupation in West Germany were dependent on Russian permission to travel through the Soviet zone.
It was an arrangement ready-made for trouble. Even so, when Clement Attlee, Harry Truman, and Joseph Stalin met here in Potsdam, around this big table, there was hope the spirit of wartime cooperation would carry over into peacetime. But it soon became clear capitalism and communism were on a collision course.
There were endless and fruitless meetings in London, in Moscow, and in Berlin by the governing authority, the Allied Control Council, led by America's military governor for Germany, General Lucius Clay, and his Soviet counterpart, General Vasily Sokolovsky.
Sokolovsky could sit through meetings and drag them out to 13 hours and make sure no decision was taken.
With these stalling tactics, Stalin hoped to keep Germany destitute, ripe for communism. This alarmed the British and Americans who had come to see communism as the new threat, the Soviets having gobbled up Eastern Europe. So they came up with a bold new strategy to merge their zones to move toward a new, self-reliant, democratic Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansionism.
By unifying the two zones and investing $1 billion jointly to get the German economy functioning again, we can have the whole area self-supporting within 3 years.
Bales of Germany's old Reichsmarks turned in for the new Deutsch or D-marks recently issued by the Western Allies in Germany's currency reform.
With the old money badly inflated and virtually worthless, the Allies introduced a new currency for the Western zones. One more action that angered the Soviets.
The Russians saw the currency reform, both Sokolovsky and in Moscow, as a threat to the economic stability of the Soviet zone.
Once it became obvious that Germany was not going to be united and that indeed Western Germany had a good chance of flourishing, thanks to common policies, thanks to outside American aid, the Russians had one card left to play, which was to put pressure on Berlin. They therefore start to pinch the lines of communication.
Something easily done by cutting off all land, rail, and waterway access to the city.
Stalin's task was to block all of Berlin's borders and force the Allies to leave under the pressure of the blockade.
The showdown moment came quickly. On June 24th, 1948, the Soviets played their final card, imposing a total blockade. The peacetime alliance had collapsed, and the first big battle of the Cold War had begun.
Suddenly, trains, 16 a day, normally arrived in Berlin from the west. Not one single train got through that day. And in the course of the day, Berliners began to realize that they were cut off from food. The island was now totally surrounded by a sea of 300,000 Soviet troops, and there seemed no escape.
Berlin these days is fighting against a huge crisis. After the first measures taken by the Soviets, the city is kept in suspense.
It gave us a terrible feeling of really being fenced in, to be cut off.
So grave is the crisis that General Clay is recalled to Washington to report on the situation. And the commander-in-chief at the White House awaits his appraisal of the most explosive situation yet in the struggle between East and West.
Once the Russians closed the land corridors to Berlin, Washington panicked.
There were some fairly senior people, more in the Pentagon than in the State Department, who felt that Berlin was lost and that one should find the best way out as possible.
One man who strongly dissented was Lucius Clay, who said the Allies must not abandon the city. The general believed the Soviets were bluffing, that the blockade could be broken, and as a test, he proposed ramming through a military convoy. But Washington said no, it was too risky and might provoke an armed clash.
General Clay was a very strong personality with very black, staring eyes, and everybody was afraid of him. I was afraid of him. We walked in there, we trembled because he was sitting at this big desk and his eyes were so stark, and he looked up at you with these big eyebrows and these black eyes, and you just trembled.
He was a workaholic. He worked 80, 90 hours a week. He was a man who didn't eat lunch because he considered that a waste of time. Instead, he smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day and drank 20 cups of coffee.
General Clay was not alone in pushing a tough stand. So did Britain's Foreign Minister Ernest Bevin, who urged Washington to be resolute. The Americans and the British decided on a daring, desperate gamble to use airplanes to keep Berlin alive.
There are still 3 air corridors, 20 miles wide each, converging on Berlin from the western zones. Stalin had conceded them because he thought they would never, ever be any kind of military threat.
But Stalin had badly miscalculated. 2 days after the blockade, the rescue mission was underway, with planes flying into 2 airfields, one here at Tempelhof in the American sector, the other, Gatow, in the British sector. Now remember, it's 3 years after the war, and in all of Europe, there are few transport planes. Not to mention pilots. Certainly nowhere near enough to supply food and fuel to 2.5 million people still reeling from war's devastation. The troops had all returned home. Now they had to be remobilized for emergency duty.
Was packing to go to Guam. She was packing in San Francisco, and I came home one night while she was still expecting to be going to Guam, and I'm on my way to Germany.
We were having lunch. We were called to the squadron ops room, and we were told we were going to Germany to fly food, etc., into Berlin, and to take enough kit for 3 days. We didn't realize it was going to be so many months.
We were flying aircraft. I mean, providing you had it seemed to us, about a compass and 4 serviceable engines, you flew.
It was very, very amateurish in the early days.
The airlift was dubbed Operation Vittles, but hardly anybody believed it could last more than a few weeks. It was all a hasty, helter-skelter beginning.
It's just after the 4th of July. And it was just shortly after this that Colonel Cassidy called us in and said, the blockade of Berlin has progressed to the point they're going to support it, and we want you to volunteer. I volunteered.
Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen of Provo, Utah, had been a cargo pilot during the war. He thought it might be an important moment in history, and so he took along his movie camera to record his airlift adventures.
We left the night before out of Mobile, just stopping for gas and something to eat, taking off out of Newfoundland now for a long overwater flight toward the Azores. Now we're headed to France. from there on, it's not far into Frankfurt. As we approach Frankfurt, the chatter on the radio is terrific.
This is Air Force 7223. 10 minutes west of U.S. station, cruising 3,500 feet. Request landing instructions. Over.
Ryan Main Tower to 7223. Who are you and where are you from? Over.
This is Air Force 7223, 19th Troop Carrier Squadron, Hickam Field, Honolulu.
Ryan Main Tower to 6421. Where are you from? Over.
Ryan Main Tower from 6421. We're from 54th Troop Carrier Squadron from Alaska. Over.
We had to load the aircraft, and then having loaded and lashed the load, the crews would come looking for an aircraft that was loaded. This is before it really got organized. And there were almost fistfights. I saw that aircraft first. No, you didn't. I did.
From the technical standpoint, it was an unbelievable operation. You needed to first you needed to organize and determine what goods were needed in Berlin and in what amounts and when.
We carried a power station, we carried cars, we carried dump trucks, we cut things up and put them back together in Berlin, and you know, everything for Berlin went in by air.
Today, with the age of computers, that would be a very easy assignment, basically. We're talking 50 years ago, nobody had even heard of a computer. Then trying to figure out how much food, how many eggs, how much milk, how much medicine, what type of medicines, all the goods that 2 million people are going to require for the next weeks, months, or possibly years, needed to be determined.
They then had to decide what is the quickest, easiest way of transporting with the limited number of planes we've got available. And the answer was dry everything. Dry the vegetables, dry the meat. They've got to have bread. Bread is bulky, send them flour. They've got their own water.
Whatever was flown in was in bags of dried potatoes, dried milk, dried this, dried that, dried mushrooms even, so that we finally could hardly see or want to see anything dried anymore. And one day I remember the Tagesspiegel had a cartoon showing a stork, and on the diaper were the words, dried baby.
To break Russia's blockade of Berlin. In the greatest peacetime aerial feat ever, giant C-54s with British planes deliver daily over 2,000 tons of food and supplies to the starvation-threatened German capital.
Well, this is taking off again at Rhein-Main. That's one of the British aircraft. And here's the good old reliable, the C-54. Now, we're loaded to the hilt. We've got every pound on there. We're really overloaded a little bit. There was 3 times as much coal flown as there was foodstuffs flown. Just flying all the time. We'd only sleep 6 to most 8 hours and then fly another 3 round trips.
It was a night and day, round-the-clock operation with fatigue an ever-present companion.
I could feel myself nodding, waking myself up. And this kept happening for a bit. And then the next thing I knew, the navigator had come through and was shaking me viciously by the shoulder. And I had gone completely to sleep. And the airplane was in a gentle spiral dive towards the earth, down to about 600 feet. But I was then able to recover.
The road to Berlin was fraught with many dangers, some from Soviet Yak and MiG fighter planes.
We were flying over hostile territory and landing in a city entirely surrounded by hostile territory.
And here's the airfield at Zerbst in East Germany, and these are Yak-3 fighters. We didn't feel too threatened because none of them shot at us. Many times we would be buzzed by these fighter planes coming up under our nose or up behind us and putting up on our wing.
When the weather got about halfway clear, then they'd play chicken with you. They'd come flying at you with a yak or a MiG or whatever. They'd come flying right straight at you, and then at the last second they'd break off. And of course, their guns were loaded, and we have no protection whatsoever.
They tried to blind us in the cockpits at night with the searchlights. And it didn't bother us because we just simply turned the lights up. It's nothing any different than flying into a thunderstorm with a lot of lightning around.
Something shot past the aircraft, and Captain and I both sort of looked at each other, and we realized it turned in front of us and started to sort of come at us from various directions. And the captain had no alternative but to lift the wing of the aircraft, and we just went right over. We lost a fair amount of height, and as we leveled out, the Russian aircraft came and sat over the starboard wing. But immediately before he left, he put the cockpit canopy back, and he looked at us and went like that.
It wasn't just the Russians. The weather was an even greater hazard.
Transports of the Airlift struggled through heavy overcast to reach airports shrouded in fog.
As the airlift grew, so too the traffic jams in the sky, leading to several crashes. 7 persons killed in the first 2 months.
A casualty of the operations is a Skymaster, which overshoots the field. Fortunately, the crew of this plane escaped uninjured.
That crash on what became known as Black Friday marked a turning point.
The weather was bad, the controller lost his nerves. One plane skidded off the runway, crashed. Another one was just about ready to crash, and there were planes lined up all over the place.
Ironically, the day-by-day airlift commander was aboard one of the planes caught in the chaos. General William Tunner realized it was all too much of a cowboy operation.
I had flown General Tunner into the city, and we got stacked up and were told to wait. So General Tunner just grabbed the microphone and said, "Send them all back home. As soon as they get out of the way, I'm coming in and landing." So I brought him in, and that's when he said, "Straighten this mess out."
General Tunner basically was the type of person who was a doer. Clay is always the person who's remembered for the airlift, and virtually nobody knows of Tunner. He had lots of airlift experience. He had supplied 60,000 soldiers during the Second World War using DC-2s flying over the Himalayas.
He would come into your office at 2 o'clock in the morning, say, "What are you working on? How's it coming?" He'd be on the flight lines all hours of the day.
He also had a nickname of Willie the Whip, but he expected everyone to work as hard as he did, and which was 12 or 14 hours a day.
We made some drastic changes in those 2 weeks, or 3 weeks we were there in Berlin. We were working primarily with the Southern Corridor. We were consulting with the British who were coming in the Northern Corridor so that there would be no conflict on the approach patterns as we conducted our approaches into the Tempelhof and they came into Gatow.
The Americans flew into Tempelhof from the south. The British flew in and out of Gatow from the north and also shared the central exit corridor with the Americans. The challenge for General Tunner and his staff was to coordinate hundreds of different planes into a rapid and relentless flow.
Baker George 2, this is the final control.
He said, "I can work this out in a system where I can have a plane land every minute if they follow a certain plan." Well, he never reached the minute, but he finally had it worked out, so a plane would land every 3 minutes.
We were one part of a great big conveyor belt. This big conveyor belt goes Frankfurt, Berlin, Frankfurt, Berlin.
That big conveyor belt was now running much smoother. But the airlift still was a long way from meeting Berlin's basic needs, and life remained a daily struggle.
The Soviet blockade of the western sector of Berlin has led to severe cutbacks. Electricity is only provided for a few hours during the day and in the evening.
Each section of Berlin got its 2 hours worth of electricity in a 24-hour period, but we didn't know when it would come on. So when it did in the middle of the night, the whole family would get up, vacuum clean, iron.
If you live in 2 rooms of a basement, if mom gets up and irons, there's no sleep for the rest of the family.
And people were still on subsistence diets, with hunger never far away. Some even dying of starvation, something the Soviets seized upon in the accelerating battle for Berlin's hearts and minds.
The Soviets tried to lure West Berliners from their scarce tables away to East Berlin to register for ration cards that would offer you better and more food. And there was a lot of discussion about that. Only very few West Berliners took advantage of it.
The mood was one of defiance and perseverance, of pulling together, Berliners from both East and West, going out of their way to help one another.
My uncle, who lived in the northeast corner of Berlin, and Berlin is a very large city, and in those days it took quite a while with subway and bus connections to come to the southwest. Here he was on a Saturday night. We opened the door, didn't know he was coming, and he stood there with a bucket full of potatoes. Now, if you bring a bucket of gold today, I don't think I would have that joy. We had Uncle Bruno bringing in potatoes.
For the Berliners, the roar of the planes was music from heaven.
The thundering of the aircraft was filled with much hope.
The airplanes were life for us.
As the days and weeks passed, the shipments became larger and larger, and soon the Berliners themselves started playing a more active role.
Now these are the German volunteers who have come to unload the airplane. And when they would walk in that plane and see a sack of flour, and they'd look at us with eyes that would make you think we couldn't have been more important in the world to them, how much they appreciated it.
So they come and want to work. Sure. And you're a little bit wondering about them to start with, whether you should trust them or not. But I've never seen anybody work that hard in my life. My gosh, they'd lift those 100-pound sacks of this, that, and the other, on and off the airplane in no time at all.
The supervisor said, "Mach schnell," and the pilot said, "Hurry up, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up," because they had to stick to their very tight schedules, not to break the flow. It was a never-ending chain.
When I was on the airlift, I used to wear my decorations and my Pathfinder badge. And, you know, many Germans would say, well, what were you doing during the war? And I'd say, well, you know, I was bombing Germany. And they'd say, did you bomb Hamburg? Did you bomb Berlin or something like that? I said, well, yes. And I was quite frank about it. And there was never any animosity. You know, they said, you know, well, that's Soviet, you know, that's the way things go. I remember on one loading gang, I think there were about 20 in a gang, I had a U-boat captain, a Reichsbank manager, and a Luftwaffe bomber squadron commander. And so our chats and things in the evenings in the compound where they stayed around a large fire and waiting for the next aircraft to be loaded, the conversations we had were quite interesting.
It was also interesting to watch a new relationship between Berliners
and Americans. They now felt almost like equals. They were allies. And we were no longer the great occupying forces. No, we were buddies now.
Well, you see, I flew there as an airline pilot also a little before the Berlin airlift started. And when our servicemen in uniform would go into a German restaurant, any German restaurant, get something to eat, the voices would all stop and everybody get up and walk out. Everybody get up and walk out. One day after that airlift started, you couldn't drink all the beer they'd set on your table. We won the war. One day.
One day, Lieutenant Halvorsen, still making his home movie, spotted some children along the airport fence, prompting him to launch his own sweet brand of personal diplomacy.
All I had in my pocket was 2 sticks of gum. Took it out, broke it in 4 pieces, passed it through the fence, and they just went bananas. About that time, an airplane came right over our head and landed on the runway right out there. And I thought, wow, if I airmail, I could deliver it tomorrow. And I said, you can't do that. It's against regulations. You got to get approval. And I said, oh, this whole airlift's not according to approval anyway. And so I just found myself saying to kids, you come back here tomorrow, and if you promise to share it, I'll drop enough of this stuff so you can all have some. He said, how are you gonna know which one you are? And I said, well, when I come over the top of Tempelhof, I'll wiggle the wings of this big airplane like this, and you'll know that's me. Get ready. Here it comes. All the parachutes are coming down to the kids, and there's a big crowd down there waiting for them. Some of it gets hung up in a tree, and they climb out on the limb. I was afraid that we're going to fall off. Here they go. They're running like crazy, and talked about a stampede.
Thus was born the legendary Candy Bomber. Lieutenant Halvorsen using handkerchiefs as tiny parachutes filled with goodies. He and other pilots dropping up to 6,000 a day.
And here sometimes a good gift from heaven. American pilots are dropping candy and toys for the children.
Across the way on the other side of town, the Russian side, the children felt cheated. So Halvorsen changed his flight plan to expand what was now being called Operation Little Vittles.
For 2 weeks, I dropped it over East Berlin, coming around the pattern. And then an officer met me at the airplane at Rhine-Main. And he said, hey, what are you doing over East Berlin? I said, I'm dropping those nasty communist kids. He says, you can't do that. I says, the law of gravity is the same on both sides of the border.
The Soviets felt differently, calling the candy drop an outrageous capitalist trick. The world responded otherwise, with sacks of donations, so many that Halvorsen soon had a staff of 6 to help out. His mail was filled with letters and drawings addressed to Uncle Wiggly Wings and the Chocolate Bomber.
The airplanes that for years brought fire and death now brought food. And I was so overwhelmed that I wrote this letter. Colonel Halvorsen became a symbol for us children.
while Berlin was becoming more divided, a political battleground between East and West, with an intensifying struggle for control of the city government.
With a never-ending display of force, German communists parade through Potsdamer Platz, carrying banners which sing the hymn of hate against the Western powers, with particular attention to the United States.
The Soviet Union felt it was a good time to bring heavy pressure on the established democratic institutions, and in particular on the city council. They were determined to drive the politicians out and put their own placemen in instead.
With tension mounting, police take a hand, and arrests are followed by small-scale riots. Violence is at every hand.
The violence and intimidation did not stop the Berliners, who responded with their own show of force, rallying behind a dynamic and savvy political leader named Ernst Reuter, who soon came to symbolize the new spirit of resistance.
You people of the world, you people in America, in England, in France, in Italy, look at this city and see that you may not abandon this city.
With 85% of the population casting ballots, Ernst Reuter was elected mayor over the strong opposition of the Soviets, who condemned the result and proceeded to appoint a communist mayor for East Berlin. The political division was now complete. But in the fall of 1948, the Berliners faced more immediate concerns, such as getting enough coal for the coming winter months. Still more planes were needed, so General Clay made a trip back home to lobby his case, arriving smack in the midst of the '48 election campaign, in which Harry Truman was battling the odds to win a second term.
In his private car, accompanied by party leaders and his family, President Truman continues his tireless campaigning.
The president broke away from the campaign trail to return to the White House and hear Clay's request for more transports. His military advisors were skeptical, believing the U.S. was concentrating too much of its air power in Europe.
The president went around the table, and not one person spoke in favor of reinforcing the airlift. And Clay thought that was it. And President Truman overruled them.
As Truman put it, we're going to stay in Berlin, period.
I asked General Clay what his feelings were at that time. I think Clay's words were, I would have voted for him for president of the world.
With more planes and personnel, the Great Air Bridge was becoming a marvel of skill and proficiency, with the whole character of the operation changing. A third airport had been built in the French sector. A new radar system made it easier to bring in the planes.
Maintain your present elevation and continue vector 315.
Mechanics were changing 60,000 spark plugs a month. It all made for a more carefree, relaxed rhythm.
You became a bit like a bus driver or bus conductor, and you know, every day was the same. You were organized into various schedules, and it became very, very routine.
A new airlift culture was developing, and among the thousands involved, there was now a genuine camaraderie, even a daily mimeograph newspaper, with a cartoonist to lampoon the good times and the not-so-good times.
I'd get, a chance to talk to the guys up there, and you know how the GIs are, they all complain about something. So they'd
complain about this and complain about that, and yeah, I'd be making notes all the time and everything else. And that's where I got most of the ideas for the cartoons.
The first few days in the officers' club, British officers' club, and breakfast was fried tomatoes on toast. Now you go out and fly for several hours to Berlin and back on a breakfast of fried tomatoes and toast. It didn't sit too well. We were very happy to get on the ground in Berlin because they had a mobile snack bar that came around the airplanes, and we could get hot dogs, hamburgers, coffee in Berlin, which was blockaded.
And the weather was miserable, absolutely miserable.
I remember coal dust. The Berlin Airlift, I had it in my ears, my nose, my eyes. Our clothes, flat suits, got soaked with coal dust.
We, the aircrew, used to emerge looking rather like miners.
We'd get back to our room and head for the shower, and the shower would run black for a while with coal dust.
It would be coal, it would be fish, anything, and the aircraft really stank. I mean, you can't get the smell of fish out of an aircraft, however much you try. And they've got in a disgusting state, these aircraft. They reckon we were handling something around 2 tons of flour each per day in 100-weight sacks.
Had gradually come to see it all as one great adventure, an adventure that in December produced a bit of bravado that dismayed the Soviets.
Right near the approach to the runway at Tegel was a radio tower, and it was operated by the Russians. They were using it as an antenna for the Russian Radio Berlin. It was in our approach area, not in approach path, but right alongside of it. It was close enough that we considered a hazard.
So the French general asked his Soviet counterpart to destroy the antenna, and in order to keep safe for the airlift pilots. But the Soviet general didn't answer.
And a French sergeant or officer came up the tower and says in broken English, "You have to leave because we're going to blow up this radio tower."
There was a terrific explosion, and I was looking at my airplane, and it actually jumped sideways. And I thought in my mind, here comes World War III.
A Soviet general came to see the French general, and he was really furious. And he said to the French general, "How could you do that?" And the French very calmly responded, "Oh, very simple, mon général, with dynamite and from below."
At Christmas, 2 well-known Americans flew into town to spread some holiday cheer.
And Bob, I wish you'd do that introduction over again.
Why, is there something wrong, Irving?
Yes. You know, you've got the name wrong. It's Irving Jones.
Irving Jones?
Yes, I changed it. Anything over here named Berlin, they cut up into sectors. I'd been so excited and so thrilled with the job everyone connected with the airlift was doing. So I called Tex, and he told me the title of the great show you're doing, Operation Vittles, and I wrote a song about it. Just rehearse this minute. Give him a big hand. And Jay, if you'll just, you know, go to it, kid. Not long ago, a group we called the Air Corps helped win the war and took a bow. Not long ago, we cheered the fighting air corps. Let's see what's happened to them now. Operation Vittles is in the proper way. And rolling wheat and hay, and everything's okay. Operation Vittles, as in the eye we go. We won't forget to blow a kiss to Uncle Joe. We're growing fonder of the wild blue yonder, singing a buck, flying a truck. No one here belittles the job that must be done. And though the war was won, we'll be there, earning stripes and bars in our old freight car till the air forgets the
As the new year arrived, the planes were swooping in record numbers, the tonnage having tripled from the early days. One pilot wrote home to his parents in New Jersey, "It seems as if every plane in Europe is flying into Berlin." It was obvious the airlift could go on indefinitely. Far more than the basic necessities were now being shipped in. Everything from doorknobs to ping pong balls to 6 million cigars, even Clarence the camel to amuse the kiddies. By now, it was dawning on the Soviets the blockade had become a political liability. Moscow began sending signals it was willing to resume negotiations. Stalin passed word to an American journalist that indicated he was looking for a way out. Soon, there was another signal from the Soviet delegate to the United Nations, Jacob Malik, who began secret talks with U.S. delegate Philip Jessup. The airlift continued to set records day after day, climaxed by one grand Easter parade of planes, twice the usual tonnage, 1,400 flights, what General Tunner described as a holiday present for the people of Berlin.
Stalin understood the airlift could go on forever. The only thing left to break the deadlock was to lift the blockade.
The Soviets capitulated, and the blockade was over. After 3 months of delicate negotiations, the Soviets acknowledged defeat, accepting some minor face-saving concessions.
A new agreement signed in New York between the USSR and the United States reaffirmed the removal of all restrictions on communications, transportation, and trade between West Berlin and the western zones of Germany.
Attention, attention. We have a communique about the lifting of the Berlin blockade. It was officially announced by the Big Four powers at 2 o'clock this afternoon that the blockade will be lifted on May 12th.
It's hard to describe the feeling we had, that we had won.
The correct time is 1 minute past midnight. The gates are being opened now, and the first vehicles are going through. Crowd in the background seem rather happy about the whole thing. There go the 3 British trucks. 1, 2, 3.
The soldiers of the sky had achieved a miracle. The airlift had succeeded far beyond what anyone had dreamed possible. 277,000 flights,
enough trips to go to the moon and back 130 times. Berlin was saved, the advance of communism across Europe stopped, and the new nation of West Germany would soon become a valued partner of the West. Despite the triumphant finale, Berlin would remain the great symbol of East-West divisions, the Cold War continuing for another 4 decades. And of course, the operation was not without cost, as shown by this monument close to Tempelhof, memorializing the 78 Americans, British, and Germans who gave their lives.
There were many heroes of the airlift. Harry Truman, the pilots and crew members, the people of Berlin, General Tunner, and of course, General Clay, who was the toast of the town.
There was the big farewell ceremony in City Hall for General Clay. I had to lean over to speak into the microphones, and I could see the tears. He was so moved by the ceremony, and he felt so strongly about the Berliners.
No matter where I may go, I shall watch always with interest the part which Berlin will play in the formation of German government, and with complete confidence that his part will be a democratic part. Therefore, I shall not use the English word goodbye, but rather try to say to you, Auf Wiedersehen.
It was the help to get through the hard time here in Berlin. Without the airlift, I don't know how the lives were going on.
We felt extremely sorry for the inhabitants of Berlin, and I felt that my efforts must be worthwhile in trying to alleviate the problems they were suffering. Those were really good, bad times. Working together for a common purpose.
We were very ordinary people living in extraordinary times.
It took 2.5 million Berliners and several 100,000 British and Americans of all kinds of training and background to keep that airlift airborne.
You can sometimes win a battle by restraint.
We saved a city without firing a shot.
Not long ago, a group we called the Air Corps helped win the war and took a bow. Not long ago, we cheered the fighting Air Corps. Let's see what's happened to them now. Operation Vittles, as in the sky we go. We won't forget to blow a kiss to Uncle Joe. We're growing fonder of the wild blue yonder, singing of us, flying across. No one here belittle the job that must be done. Although the war was won,